the main purpose of an interview is to inform an audience, to enlighten people on a subject that they might not know much about. It's a very, as I said before, a very useful skill to know how to do because it offers a different insight into a person or a character that you may not ordinarily get from a straight narration or somebody talking straight to a camera that, spieling off something that's like a scripted version of some information they want to give you, whereas with an interview, it can be very personal and you often see closer insight into what motivates a person and a bit more of the humanity rather than something that's very scripted and structured. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing to know how to do. I love conducting interviews because you really get to know somebody. You feel like you sort of become part of their world. So today we'll be using some equipment that you might ordinarily have at home, like iPhones or iPads, and just connecting a lapel mic into your iPhone or your Android phone, clipping it on and monitoring the sound you're recording. And you actually have to have a practice of recording your own interviews with each other, and then we can have a look back at that footage and see what you've captured. So Pauline's going to talk a bit about how to make your interviewee feel comfortable and how you can help them sort of, become comfortable with revealing themselves a bit on camera and, how to hold themselves.
Yeah, and I guess the key to remember is that your interviewee is going to feel as nervous as you are. I don't think anybody does an interview and doesn't feel nervous, especially now that we're having to look at equipment as well. So we've got a lot of stuff going around in our mind of making sure that we've got things right. But the key for interviewing somebody, I found, in my experience, was just to know a lot about that person. If you know a lot about the person, you're already going in there thinking, now what do I want to get out of this interview? So that you can ask the right questions. And also you can ask them for just a brief biography. So if they can send you through an email of a little bit about their life, or nowadays we have lots of technology that we didn't have 30 years ago, and so you can actually go into Google. There's a lot of information about people. If it's somebody who has a profile on LinkedIn or something like that, or on social media, you could actually have a look at that as well. Try to bring in as much information. The more that you know, the more intelligent the questions are going to be. Whereas if you're just if you're going blank, you're leaving it to chance, and you really want to have an idea in your head of what you want the interview to come out like at the end. So that's one of the keys. The second one is to make sure that your interviewee feels calm and comfortable. And we spoke a little bit about poise in that last week, but it's really about making sure that you're comfortable, that you're not focused on yourself and how you look, but really focused on what's the story that's going to come out in the end. Always remember that they're interested, the audience is interested in what you have to say, not so much what you look like. So if you can really keep your poise, making sure that you're all together, take some deep breaths if you need to, and just keep reassuring them that everything's okay, because most people just want to know that they sound okay and that they're doing okay. So that's another key as well. Also, making sure that you pick a quiet location that's well lit. You don't really want to have too many noises distracting you, because otherwise your interviewee is going to be looking at whatever's around you rather than focusing on you, and then that means that the audience is going to be looking to see, well, what is she looking at, or what is he looking at? So try to pick a nice quiet place and make sure that you're both comfortable and not too distracted. Another thing is body language. So when I was actually looking at Oprah Winfrey, because she's like the queen of interviews, looking at some of her little YouTube clips, because I'm like, what makes her so so special. And it's that she gets her interviewee to feel comfortable on camera. She humanises them. She makes them feel that they can open up and reveal anything to her, and she actually allows them to bring out the emotion. So for me, actually looking at some of her stories that she has was really about, I guess, being in sync with whoever you're interviewing, and you can do that by mirroring. So if Jennene and I were mirroring, so she's got her arm there, I would just automatically have my arm there and I would be facing towards her. So if I wasn't mirroring, my body language would be like this. So just imagine a mirror, and you want her to feel comfortable, so I would be, looking at Jennene, and I would basically be almost mirroring what she's doing without it being too obvious. It's just subtle little things that you can do so that she knows, okay, I'm looking at you, I'm listening, I'm hearing what you're saying, and then she's going to feel comfortable. The more comfortable your interviewee feels, the more open that they're going to become, so I can then start to ask some lovely questions that she may want to reveal to me or may not. So that's really the key, is to make sure that your interviewee feels really comfortable. Another one is really just get them to repeat the question in the answer. So if you are asking a question, you would say, what did you do on Sunday? The interviewee would say, on Sunday, I did da-da-da-da-da. So always get them to repeat the question in the answer. That's really the key to making sure that you've got full sentences, because what will happen is if you're filming and you have to edit and you say, so what did you do on Sunday? All you'll hear is, I did such and such and such and such. And then when you play it back, the people will be going, I did such and such and such and such. For what? What was the question? So if they say on Sunday, I did such and such and such and such, so that's actually included in the editing, and it makes it much easier for the audience to understand. Otherwise, you may have to go back over and do a sound and say, and add that in, which means more work for you. It's easier just to include it in the actual question itself, if that makes sense. What else? So do you want me to keep going a little bit more?
That's all right. I can.
Yeah,
say a little bit.
I'll hand it over to Jennene. I feel like I've spoken enough now.
So reinforcing what Pauline was saying about choosing your location well, depending on what type of interview you're conducting, it could be a more professional setup. You might be in somebody's office. They might have, their computer there and some, business type books in the background, or it could be in front of a building where they work, or if it's a more personal sort of interview, it could be at somebody's house with their, belongings in the background. It'll have a lot more warm feel to it. If they're an outdoorsy person, you might want to shoot at a local park or at the beach, but you really need to be careful that you're not picking up the surrounding ambient noise. So at a beach is not usually ideal, to be honest, but a lot of the time it's really, practical for the story you're trying to tell. So that's when you would use a lapel mic or a lavalier mic clipped up really close to their mouth, so that you're not picking up the ambient noise of your surroundings, things like traffic noise, waves crashing onto the shore. They're really distracting when you're conducting an interview. They're distracting for the audience trying to listen to what the person is saying. So it's really important to get good audio and to think a lot about your setting, how to make it personalised to your interviewee so that it's relevant to the story you're telling and it's relevant to them. So when you've chosen your location, you need to think about how you frame up your interview. So I mentioned in my previous workshop last week that it's a good idea to sort of pay attention to the rule of thirds, which is the horizontal and vertical grid line that you can kind of invisibly superimpose over your monitor where the screen you're recording from, and line up a person on those interconnecting grid points. So there'll be 4 intersection points there, but you'll want to line them up on either the top left or the top right hand side of those grid points. And you can see in this example here, in the handout, you need to have them looking across the frame. So with an interview, you don't have your subject matter looking, or your interviewee looking straight down the lens. That's more presenting or reporting sort of style. For an interview, you want them looking across camera towards you, and you, as the director or the conductor of the interview, you want them looking at you answering. So they need to have a direct eye line with you. And you'll also see in the picture down the bottom of that same page that you don't sort of position them centrally in the frame. It's off to either the right or the left-hand side, and they'll have what's called a short side and a long side on either side of their face. So you need to make sure the way they're looking across the frame, you've positioned the long side and they're looking across the long side. It's just a much more pleasing framing for the audience to look at, and it also allows you to add like what's called a super, which is the text that shows their name and their role or their position sort of thing, for the audience to get a very quick glimpse of who they are. So that leaves a nice space for that as well. And then once you've framed them up and you've mic'd them up and you're happy with your audio, well before this actually, you need to think about your questions, because there's always a purpose to an interview. You might be interviewing a thought leader or somebody who conducts a business. You might want to know more about that business or that organisation. It might be a relative who you want to get their family history on camera, and interview them about their story, their personal story. And you need to structure your questions so that you get a good all-round backstory of who they are and what their motivation is, and how they see the world, basically. And that will give you, if you sort of write up, I don't know, a dozen or so questions that you think are going to elicit the right response that you're hoping for in your interview, that is a very helpful thing to do, so that you're not sort of sitting there in the interview and thinking, what am I going to ask them? I mean, of course, you don't have to stick to that set of questions, because your interviewee might veer off into different directions, and then you'll want to pick up on those threads sometimes and go down a different tangent than what your original questions were. But to have those guidelines there is a really good thing to have up front, in case you don't want to sort of get to cutting your interview together and realising you don't have enough material to make an interesting story. So, with my interviews, I do tend to write up a lot of questions and interview somebody for about an hour, and then I'll feel like I've got enough material. That probably might be overkill for some people. They might think that's too long, but generally I find about an hour for an interview is a fairly good standard. How about you, Pauline?
I think in my experience, I tended to interview more people at once. So it was probably had about 5 to 10 questions for each one, because I had a few different subjects that I had to interview as part of that story. So I guess depending on how many you're interviewing, if it's just one person, I would be the same. Better to have more questions than not enough, and better to have more material, like Jennene said, than not enough material. So, because you can always edit it out. But I think the other thing too, I was thinking, and this has happened to me personally, that your interviewee can take you around, down the paddock, around the bend, past the creek, and so you have to really remember in your mind what you want, because you've got to bring them back, and you have to be able to use your questions to bring them back to the story that you've got. I mean, it's just like us when we're having a conversation with people. You know, one thought's going to lead to another thought, which will lead to another thought, and that's the same with an interview. So just try to remember, okay, yeah, this is really good. Do I really want to continue on this thread? Is that going to actually help to bring out something that I didn't even think about? Because sometimes our interviewee will actually point us in a direction that we didn't even think about. And if it's really good for the story, then continue with that. But always have your end goal in mind. Whatever it is that you really want to get to at the end, continue with that. And remember that even it's probably better to let them run a little bit and then edit later, because you've got that information, rather than cut them off. There's nothing worse than being cut off when you're trying to share a part of your story. It's better to let them talk and feel that you're listening to them than actually cut them off, because otherwise you're just going to close them down, and they're going to be like, you're not actually listening to me, so why should I open up and tell you more about myself? So if you let them run a little bit, and then you can always edit it later as well. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you always want to make sure you are doing more listening than talking.
Yeah.
You know, once you've asked your question, just use gestures to show that you are listening and paying attention rather than talking, because it's really annoying, I know, being an editor as well, having to cut out the yeses and nos and, you know, kind of thing from an interviewer.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't talk.
I'm laughing because this is something that I had to learn to do, because I'm such an expressive person, and so when people are talking to me, like, I get really engaged and I want to say, yes, I hear you, I understand you, and I have to literally in my head say, don't say anything.
Yeah.
Don't
just
say
nod.
anything.
Just nod and smile.
Yeah, so I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
And it can seem quite put on at first, but after a while you do get used to it, which is why I'm sitting here just looking at Jennene and nodding now, because I know I need to be quiet. So it takes practice, but like Jennene said too, it's better that you don't nod, because it's really hard to edit over it. If you're having to edit later and somebody's in the background going, oh yes, I understand that, then you're actually distracting your audience from what they need to hear. So just say to them ahead of time, look, you know, I am listening to you. I will nod. I won't respond vocally, but I am listening, and, you know, I will nod to you, and then that'll actually help me later on in the interview. So just explain it to them. And I've had to sit there with different people that I've interviewed, and then literally looking at them, and I've asked them the question, they're talking to me, and then all I'm doing for the camera work later is just sitting there and I'm going. And it does seem really weird, but once you actually pull it all together, it makes sense, because you need to be able to have those responses cut in later on. As it is strange, but you do get used to it. It does come a little bit after. So yeah. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question, Laurie? What is the role of I know but as the interviewer though, you have to have a presence as well. But if you're nodding a lot, that's fine.
Yeah. It's really to get the information from the person first. So your role is to get your interviewee to open up. It's not really about you. So you're just trying to get that information from them. So that's why it's better to listen, and it's better to let them talk, because this isn't really about our knowledge. This is about getting them to share their knowledge. So if we were doing a report and you're talking straight to the camera, yeah, that's about your knowledge, it's about what you know. But with interviewing, it's different. And so that's why it's important for you to do your background information. So you know the information, but then you're getting them to bring out more. And the key to that is ask good questions and listen and nod. Not lots if you have to. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just on that point, it is really important to do a background search on a person or a subject. That might sound a bit invasive, but you don't want to sort of face stalk somebody, not in that way, but it's do a Google search and just do that background research so that you've got a bit of a clearer picture of who you're talking to and what might their motivations be, and you can structure your questions then knowing that information and what might be interesting to them. Some other technical things that you'll need to keep in mind are lighting. So the room that you're in or the setting that you're filming in will need to be well lit. If it's indoors, skylights are great. You would never position somebody right next to a window though, because the light that's coming in from a window is really inconsistent. When the sun goes behind the cloud, you'll get different light on your interviewee's face. But it's good if a room is well lit with sunlight. Just put your subject or your interviewee away from the window and maybe fill the side of their face with some artificial light, an LED panel or whatever light source you have access to. Just be careful of the colour temperature of that light though. You wouldn't want it to be a really yellow light. That's probably enough for this workshop on lighting. I mean, it's a really technical thing and it's a whole other subject matter altogether. But after we finish filming, we will be practicing with a softbox light to bounce some light onto your interviewee's face, because obviously that's a lot more flattering than a dull, flat image that's not well lit. If you're outdoors, you'll need to be careful of not filming in those really unflattering hours right in the middle of the day where the sun's directly overhead and it's going to cast shadows over your interviewee's face, under their eyes and under their nose. Then you might use something like a reflector to bounce some nice, golden light up under their face or onto the side of their face. And then you can also use the scrim inside to put it over the top of somebody's head so that if there is direct sunlight, it's going to filter it from your interviewee's face. You'll need a second or third person obviously to hold that scrim up, but that's a very handy tool to have. And also something to keep in mind when you're filming is perhaps capturing two different camera angles. Like, it's quite nice to see a wide shot first of your interviewee, and then once you've kind of broken the ice a bit with them, you might crop in a bit closer and ask a few more personal questions so that the audience feels like they're getting a deeper insight. You're cropped in a bit tighter on their face rather than sort of head and shoulders. Getting a wide shot or a medium wide shot and then cutting in for a close-up as another camera angle is a really good way to conduct an interview. So there's a lot to it.
And I think the key is don't be overwhelmed by it. Really, it's just to humanise your subject. And through the use of the cameras, through the use of the lighting, you'll add depth because you're seeing on a screen and on a screen we can look flat. And so we really want to try to make sure that our subject has depth behind them, so that people feel like they're in the, wherever that person is sitting, that you're actually there with them. Because the closer you can feel to that person, the more you're, I guess, going to be drawn into the conversation that's being had. So that's the key. Just think about, how can I make this, how can I make the audience feel like they're actually here? And if you can do that, then people are going to listen and they're going to be drawn in to your interview.